As we're all aware, the situation in Peru is very complicated. We'd like to welcome you all to this webinar and thank our panelists for being with us today. We will also be welcoming the Peruvian ambassador to Canada. Before that, I will just make a few comments on what is happening.
There's no doubt that the self-coup of President Castillo was illegal, and also the resignation of the President Baluarte was the legal response. The resulting manifestations, demonstrations, um, asking the current President Baluarte to resign, and was the manifestation against the sclerotic and corrupt, many people say, Congress. The political reaction has been excessive and brutal and tragic, as you have all seen in the news. The demands are increasing, and there are several groups, and therefore the topics that there's no leaders to channel the demands. One of the general demands is the change in the treatment of second-class citizens, which keeps the country maintains with the indigenous peoples. Some demands are contradictory and they might have unexpected consequences. We want to use this time to speak about the uh, different styles that have caused more confusion and find possible ways to dialogue about the gaps. Well, with these comments on a very complicated topic, I want to start by giving the floor to Jimena. Please, the question is, what are the other problems that have been arisen besides the main complaint about the uh, uh, suspension of President Baluarte? What other demands have turned up? Thank you, everybody in the panel, and thank you for the invitation. Um, yes, I think it's obvious that the marches are started, and as a rejection to the reaction of the continuity of the Congress and the actions of Baluarte and the attempted coup. Uh, People have said that if Castillo were left, 80% of the people wanted the people Castillo to leave, except the generals. Uh, but since we began, what we've seen is that there's an increase in the attendance of the protests, and we see that the reaction by the police and the state, instead of dissuading the participation by the uh, protesters, has done exactly the opposite. I think it's undeniable for that it's the state's reaction before these manifestations, these demonstrations, what has given rise to this size of this problem. I've asking the in the demonstration, I've seen that when you ask the people why they're there, why they're and there's why are they going to protest against this history of state repression over the past several months? There's a feeling that there's injustice, racism, that their lives are not worth much, that their voice and their witnesses are not worth much, that it doesn't matter whether they, as they say, are there for political reasons, legitimate reasons. The government and the press have dubbed them as terrorists, and I think this has been the start of another types of expressions. So there are demands which are obviously specific in many cases they, about the position of President Castillo. I think they're the designation of Ms. Baluarte and the new constitution as well. But I think that beyond those demands, specific demands, what we are seeing is more, not the demands, perhaps not, but the reaction vis-à-vis what many people perceive as cultural violence that have been seen in these manifestations, these demonstrations. Thank you, Tania. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for this space, which, from my point of view, is multidisciplinary and multi-actor. I'd like to uh, speak from my indigenous point of view and as an artist, and because I've had an experience in Parliament, but anyway, uh, to start this dialogue in the most honest and sincerest way possible vis-à-vis what we're facing here in our country, which affects all as on the first lines. I think that there's not a single factor, as Jimena has said, and Ken also has been set up the premise that there's an accumulation of issues. They're fed up. The population is fed up. That is seen in this lack of legitimacy and rejection to the current political class, but also in the previous ones. This is a crisis that we've been uh, living since 2016, when we saw a lot of corruption involving the state, the public officers, presidents, former presidents, corruption in the system, justice, uh, prosecutors and judges being questioned, and they had other people in political operators in parliament. And during this period, all of this led to the dissolution of the Congress in 2019. That crisis didn't finish, and what we have right now is an exacerbated crisis where the political class basically has lost prestige with its actions. They are There's this lack of legitimacy by the citizenship, but rejecting the attitudes, positions. It's a parliament that doesn't have a firm and partial voice against those who commit corrupt acts, but all the contrary. But many people are fed up, and they don't say it all in the major demonstrations that are. We have to say that the political actions, the discussions, and the decisions made in the powers of the state have an impact on people's lives, and people of the south of the Andes, who were the ones who started the mobilizations, what we see that their everyday lives, the quality of education, that they don't have access to health, and the access to justice, the work opportunities, and economy, among others. We have to add another item in Parliament, which is the rejections and the non-acceptance of the results of the latest elections. It has been also something that has created some unrest in the population, because we didn't recognize Mr. Pedro Castillo as president, saying that there had been electoral fraud. They set up an investigating committee for uh, processual electoral processes that didn't have any final results. So there is a confrontation between the parliament and then the executive, and there's also um, a contest of power. But we must not forget that Mr. Castillo's actions has not had the best performance. We have had constant changes of ministers, censorship by the parliament uh, again and again, and we also have these accusations about corruption about their families against Mr. Pedro Castillo. And so far, the Congress was confrontational vis-à-vis the executive. we have another different scenario. And something that Jimena mentioned, and I'd like to point out too, uh, very firmly, is that uh, an element that cuts across everything that we've been saying has to do with this major structural problem of racism and discrimination, which latent and is normal in our country, especially among the traditional political classes, starting with the political structures of the state. This lack of value for the Indians or the Amazon peoples, all that is also another aspect that which we reject. And you see, wait, that's not right. We cannot consider this normal. We cannot tolerate them to be discriminating against us, and that's why we are beginning to speak up and proposing a change for the country. This would be some of the other items. We've said a lot of the needs, social needs and poverty that this population group that is wants to mobilize has been asking for these rights. And what they are saying is that they're not social rights that have been postponed for decades, but there's a political, uh, latent political repression. And there's a citizen position about this political crisis vis-a-vis a political class that has not had the responses for the crisis, or at least not the most appropriate responses. Thank you, Tanya. A short question, and then we'll go back up to Bob. Could you, if I understand you correctly, the first period of President Castillo was a spark that activated all these problems today. There were no, there was no great hurry to protect or support the coup. This was the spark to channel the complaints and demands, and which have much deeper roots than what happened with President Castillo. Is that so? That's what I understand. I think that when Mr. Castillo sent his message, his self coup, and there were some things demanding their liberation and the reinstatement in the. But over the weeks and months, this this has no longer had some echo, although it was the trigger. In he has to be responsible before justice, and hopefully everyone who needs to be investigated were to be investigated. But today's demands of the people are very clear uh, vis-a-vis a political class which has been losing legitimacy due to its own actions, and that's what we feel and hear in the streets. I don't think that there's no unanimous motto saying, reinstate Mr. Castillo or his liberation. There are some clear claims, and the most critical position and self-critical position is that we have a country that has been constantly being reformed because we have had some very weak institutions. The institutions have been um, debilitated over time. This is not just the fact that Mr. Castillo is now in jail, or they had been ousted by Congress. That's not the real trigger. There were some things that really sparked the situation, because the south of the Indian was represented by Mr. Castillo, and everything that he had on him, his background as a teacher, as a rural person. So the racism in Peru is so strong that it's touching the lives and dignity of everybody. So it is not just not the natural way to normal way to to relate to each other and live among all Peruvians. Bob, do you have something? Can you hear me? Well, thank you for the invitation. I am very agree with Tania. There is no specific demands, uh, but there is a response to what has happened. Jimena said that. And Tania speaks about the corruption of the political system and the rejection. In each demonstration in Peru or elsewhere, there are structural causes. The the kindle for the fire. And in Peru, we see economic inequality, we see racism, we see political corruption, and yes, we know that that started in 2016 or earlier. Uh, there's also the spark, the trigger, which was the self-coup by Mr. Castillo. And then there's an accelerant, and that's the police violence. And we've seen that also. Right now, the protests are less about Castillo and what happened, uh, uh, and more about this is 2023, and we have to speak about political violence and what is going on with Boluarte in a country that has a president every year right now. It seems that seems to be happening now. We're saying the presence of Boluarte. Now we're going to have more changes, more presidents coming in this next coming year. The most likely things is that we're going to have elections this year or next year. Perhaps we're going to see a change before the elections, and we're going to see changes and changes until somebody can uh, answer for these demonstrations. The thing is that the government wants to blame the protesters and doesn't want to have a dialogue. There are some extremists in the protesters, but that is not something that the government should start and talk about those demonstrators, and that would help to have more changes. Mm, that isn't going to be happening soon, and that is a problem. Thank you, boss. Eduardo, can you comment about what you've heard so far? But I want to move forward uh, up to a point. It's interesting to see the students, or at least some students, are in the demonstrations when Castillo himself and some who are behind him are very much against progressiveness or uh, by, by, proposed by several students. There are several demonstrators who are against abortions, against equal marriage. So Castillo came with a very conservative social agenda, so to speak. So how can we? It's a very weird combination of protesters. Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Jimena, uh, James, and Tania for sharing this panel. Obviously, these topics of favoritism in Castillo was relativized as Lula, as they've been promoting their actions. He left a vacuum. Although his position is conservative, that decreased the quota of progressive leftist. And this made it more of a horizontal democratic line. There's a number of mistakes. The lack of paucity in unique positions. and also the problems with managing the budget. There's a disappointment in Castillo, which at the beginning it was a small flag, but this protest uh, where this flag was being diluted. About what you said, uh, we've also said we've seen a trajectory as with respect to the demonstrations. It comes from the political and affects the economic aspects, and which is becoming more uh, claiming structural complaints and as uh, lead to historical uh, complaints, and we have to vindicate the uh, claims against the indigenous peoples. We see the precariousness, the weakness of the constitution. We see that the trigger um, has been this, and we have assumed a more of a citizen role. There's a survey there saying that 50% of the Peruvians uh, agreed with the demonstration. And January 30th, the same survey, the same company discovered that the level of agreement was 89% with the demonstrations. So there's not a matter of the ideological position about all of these thorns. Uh, we also seeing that the community is demanding more legitimacy for the citizens. Now I have the pleasure to invite the Peruvian ambassador of Peru in Canada, Mr. Rodriguez, who will make some comments about what he has heard so far. Ambassador, are you with us? Welcome, Ambassador. Yes, thank you. Welcome, Ambassador. Short comments about what you have heard so far. Thank you, Mr. Frankel. First of all, thank you for and the uh, Canadian Council for the Americans for allowing me to say a few words in this event. Also, congratulate the speakers whom have provided valuable contributions from each point of view, and also a cordial greeting to all of those who are following this event. If you allow me, I would like to speak about the uh, title, Peru, a recurring crisis. This is, for the past few years, the government has gone through a series of changes in the government and the interruption of mandates. The authorities over the past 7 years shows a series of deep problems in our political system. The lack of care for the most historical demands and extreme polarization among all the uh, actors. But I also think it's important to recognize that Peru has been able to manage these recurring crises, always maintain a constitutional order and a state of law. Our democracy has worked so far because all the changes in Congress, in government, have followed the strict democratic process, as it was said when December 7th, when uh, the president had a coup through the message to the nation, they didn't have a democratic response. And that is a value that we have to preserve and value, because it is not possible to accept that in the 21st century a single person can be close Congress and intervene with the judiciary and decide for the other institutions and take on all the powers. It must point out that all the democratic institutions reacted to a very serious attempt to walk back everything that we had gained over the past several years. That's why Mrs. Malduarte and the presidency of the Republic did that, preserving the constitutional order and democracy and the state of law. But this followed the Constitution to the letter. It's important to point out that December 7, we democracy and the state of law prevail over an attempted coup. We believe that the Peru is an imperfect democracy. There's still a lot to be done to strengthen our institutions. In this process, we continue to be we're betting on democracy, reject authoritarianism wherever it comes from. Because history has taught us that democracy is the most fair and convenient way to live in harmony. It's a space where the participation of the citizens is the factor that materializes changes, but it is necessary to have governors and citizens to establish a dialogue, to achieve common objectives. This includes preserving the freedom of the press, even if we don't agree, as well as the agree to protest without using violence as a resource for expression. The Peruvian state maintains as its basic values this defense of democratic institutions, the state of law, and the defense and promotion of human rights. These three axes are complementary. There cannot be a democracy with a state of law, and there can be no state of law where there is no protection of human rights, and those who are violating them are not punished. All this, the democracy must be recognized. Undoubtedly, that the freedom of the expression must be recognized. The right to peaceful assembly and the right to protest as a way to express ideas and visions or values of which are dissenting or opposition. This has been recognized by the political constitution. Social process as a manifestation of the freedom of expression, together with the freedom of assembly and the freedom of transit, plays an important role to benefit the entire collective. In a democratic society, the right to protest has or is one of the ways which the citizens have to monitor the actions of their governors. Most of the protests and demonstrations that we've seen have fair and undeniable demands, which are, as I said, part of the historic debt with the historical sectors of the population. But we've seen witnesses, and there are some violent groups, and I am not stigmatizing or defining. I'm just mentioning a fact. There have been violent groups that have had serious attacks coordinated against the public and private property, the critical structure, and the authorities. This must be rejected by all the citizens that are looking for a democratic country. Violence cannot be used to legitimize process. There shouldn't be a way to channelize social demands, and it shouldn't be the reason for the cause of 10 people to die, including 2 children. This is the only way to achieve social peace and solve these problems, not only in the Andean region, but also in the entire country. We defend the right to protest, as seen in the protesters, and they have nothing against the protesters. Just a question, and thank you for your comments. Just a question. So you're saying that there has not been an excess of force by the police or the authorities? I've seen that say that there is no policy of repression and that there is no reason to justify the loss of human life. And the fact is that the government has reacted immediately by inviting the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the High Representative of the United Nations for Human Rights, to come to Peru and investigate And the government has also provided best facilities for the research to verify the facts. We have a clear willingness of the government so that the use of excessive use of the public forces has to be investigated and sanctioned. We need to go on with the questions. But the simple question is, does the government does not recognize any use of excessive force by the police, or does it recognize that there has been excessive use of force? What the government is recognizing is that we should do investigations vis-a-vis the loss of lives. We're giving all the facilities to the Justice Department, and internationally, as I said, we invited the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the High Commissioner for Human Rights to verify the facts, and we've made it easier for them to not only to meet the people from the government but also from civil society, and we have giving them the logistics so that they can visit the places where the facts took place. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your comments. Everybody has their hands raised, but I don't want to go over that line because what we want to continue with the time that we have, and perhaps at the end we will go back to the topic, because otherwise we'll never get back out of the problem that we have right now. So what I wanted to say is about the two possible, according to some, exits of this current crisis is to call for a constitutional convention, and another one is to call for elections, or perhaps both things at the same time. But I want to first look into the idea of convening a constituent assembly. What do you think about would this calm down what's going on in Peru up to a point? What happened also in Chile with the Constituent Assembly, although there have been results rejected by the people, but they would have the effect of calming the water. Could that have an effect of calming things down? Bob, what do you think about it? The conventional I think that you all want to answer. Before going to do some analysis, but in public opinion, it's obvious that people reject violence during the manifestations, demonstrations. More than 80% reject violence. In addition, almost 60% support the protest. And if people can separate the demonstration from violence, also the government can do that. In addition, there's a high level of rejection about police violence that we've seen, and that's very important for the government to respond to that and accept that it has happened. Now the Constituent Assembly, I think that that is going to happen with the Congress. Might happen, but the thing about that in Chile was that when they started with that process, there was errors in the process. They tried to do the process again. So in Peru, if you try to do it, they don't have the defense of democracy as a point. It is going to be very difficult to have the dialogue, and anything can change. It might help some people and some parts of the political system that do not represent the protesters, but rather those who are in the government right now. So we need to discuss about the rules for the constitution before we can have the uh, the assembly. Now let's talk about the other panel members. Who wants to answer that? Reply by the Constituent Assembly. Is that a good idea? Could that be a good idea? Tania want to say, or Jimena? Yeah, thank you, Ken. Uh, Allow me. I not want to make any personal uh, uh, accusations, but there was not an appropriate response. The, uh, the right to the demonstrations uh, has not been accepted. There is some repressions in Ayacucho where there are more than 60 people dead. Uh, this has increased the demonstration, the protest, and increased the indignation. That's why our people from the regions in the south and other areas of the country are totally indignant and totally entitled to denounce the acts of violation against human rights. And they've been pointing uh, everybody who's participating in the mobilizations as terrorists. How can you tell an ordinary uh, citizen who suffered the greatest moments of terror of in their history that they are terrorists? I think it's unacceptable to say that in our country is democratic and freedom of the press is respected. That is not true. In our country, we are violating human rights of people, and it is not a single way to recognize our responsibility by the acknowledged by the state about these deaths. On the contrary, we're saying that the deaths have been caused by the demonstrators. I've been in the mobilizations. The mobilizations are creative. There's art. There's music and there's dance. I don't know that there are violent protest groups that want to misrepresent the marches, but we cannot say that you can rate them as a generic problem in the country. We have to say that clearly. Unfortunately, the press, especially the the elite press from Lima, do not publish what is really happening. We don't see in a TV the repression where we're shooting directly to the against the demonstrators. I agree that they should be investigated, and I hope that those investigations will start not 10 years from now, like it happened in the 80s, that all regions like mine were still waiting for 30 or 35 years to have a little bit of justice. We don't want the country to be the country of impunity. And there's a generation that reached the context, has been able to have access to university, and we want the best for our country, but we cannot have a just and egalitarian country by believing that people's lives are not are meaningless for the country. So what are the people asking for? One of their demands initially was proposed by the political parties, which is a new constitution, a constitutional process. But we've been talking about since 2017. When I was there, I heard that from the political parties, some movements, social movements, collectives that also had as part of their platform that started to grow among the community. I think an IP survey in Germany that 69% of the respondents agreed with the Constitutional Assembly to see whether we want a new constitution. So we want that to be through a Constitutional Assembly where we have a pluralistic representation. And this Constitutional Assembly should represent diversity of cultures that we have in our country. And as an indigenous woman, I must say that the original peoples need to be there making our proposals asking for the recognition of specific rights which are not in our constitution, were not even mentioned in the charter. So our specific demand is to have a national referendum so that people agree or not. It's to add to the demonstrations in this question which the parliament doesn't agree, or the group they refuse to be included in the final text which is being currently debated. So what I see down deep is that the executive and the legislative don't want to leave their jobs, their positions, or their seats. There are other reasons, I think, that make these actors are not thinking about the country or the crisis that is harming everybody, even the demonstrators uh, that come and spend a week in Lima doing their own efforts and working with solidarity and cooperation because they have the right to return to their towns, but there's no response by those who have provided the answer. So this blocks the idea of having a process where we can build a new participated constitution as pluralistic and democratic as possible. That would be the ideal. But the scenario is much more complex today because the parliament has an important uh, action because they approve what is going on to so and whether we are going to have or not to have an assembly, which from what I see is not going to happen. Thank you, Tanya. Jimena, do you want to say about something about the ambassador's comment? But I think that, Tanya covered that very well. If you forgive me, I want to continue with the line that we're talking about. Uh, there is no risk of we don't know what will be the results of a constituent assembly in a country where 70% is, if I understand it, according to the surveys, is against egalitarian marriage. The Constituent Assembly, that's one example of social rights, minority rights. The result of a Constitutional Assembly could be even worse in several ways. What do you think about that? Yes, I'd like to connect the previous question. I knew you were going to do that. No, I just want to round it off. I'm not going to, I'm not going to reply to the ambassador. Uh, but I'd like to say that what Tanya said about that we've spoken about from Lima. They said that this is the expression of the demand, but there's no investment. There's just hospitals, but there's also something that I don't agree with. That it's not only those specific demands; it's a demand of the right to political participation, and we want that to be recognized. It's a political demand, and I also think that it's justified because the students in these cases support also the demonstrations because we're saying as a country says we're not having the necessary basis that we should have to start to talk about other things, which is the right to political participation and the right to have the voice of every citizen to be respected. I think that there are many people in this country who, when they go to vote and they try to seal the election by saying that there's fraud or some sort of, without any type of proof, and then to try to oust the president that they elected for 3 times. Manifestations, demonstrations are no good. So we've seen police repression and the state doesn't recognize that. So what's happening? People say, okay, it didn't work. I was going to work. I didn't work. So what is the next step? Let's all get together. Let's do a new constitution. I agree. It's one of my great fears is the constitution that we might end would be significantly worse than what we have then. I have no problem saying that, admitting that, but I think that even with under those consequences, we would have a chance to recognize ourselves as a country and to recognize ourselves as citizens that are capable of creating our own future, and especially to the citizens that have been more stigmatized, more marginalized, and more pushed aside. So I do agree. It's saying that the students' report is strange, and perhaps we have a worse constitution, but I think that the process itself might, in the long term, make us into a better country, in where everyone can participate as active actors of our future, and where our voice and testimony are heard and are not denied from the politics or the memes or the media. I want it to be recognized as something that exists and that is real. Thank you very clearly. Have you had you have had your hand raised for several seconds? I just wanted to say hi. What? You can be both things. The constituent or new elections or pros and cons. 10 seconds, I promise, about what we just heard from this top official. Very, very simple things. We are divorced between royalty and Peru. You speak about the people from Lima. There's no data evidence, and like Tania said, there's no democracy with 60 deaths and more than 1,200 injured. Now let's talk about the Constitution. In politics and in economics and in life, there are times when you have to weigh the urgent versus uh, about what's important. What we see in many economists is that right now there's a call. A constitutional assembly is a process that must be discussed, must be argued, that must be learned, that must be subjected to a learning process by everyone. I'm not speaking of a single sector. I'm talking about all Peruvians. And in that path, we believe that a new constitution is important but not urgent. What is urgent is fight corruption, precariousness, uh, provide jobs, real economy, consolidate fiscal policies, define some parameters for growth, development, and economic well-being. A new constitution would probably will not feed those points. I think that a new constitution is more is valid from the discussion or debate, but not for the short term where we have to fix the economy or to set up the basis of a stronger institutionality of combating and eliminating corruption and impunity. I think that the process of a constituent must be seen as a sort of as an antibiotic treatment be, before the paracetamol. It will take the pain away, but that we think that's a momentary uh, solution. But the antibiotic will prolong the treatment and will make you less liable to infections. I think that the Constitutional Assembly and it's important to have this national debate because, as Jimena has said, uh, uh, we can improve the dialogues, we can improve the environment and improve ourselves as Peruvians, but also we believe that it is not urgent that we run. What is urgent is to consolidate the institutions as a republic which is very, very wounded. One of the antibiotics is to call for elections as soon as possible. I think there's no doubt about it. Um, uh, Early elections which will allow not only to complete put an end to this cycle of violence, structural violence that we're going through, but also to allow for order and institutionality. I think that is urgent, and I think that the uh, elections are increasingly necessary. So I see by your face that you are in favor of elections as soon as possible. And Ken, I'm being told that Congress has rejected a new text to advance the elections for 2023. Yes, Eduardo. Boss, what do you think about this? Do you think that new elections might solve, if not everything, it could move a little bit forward towards a solution, or will that be the same thing with a different name? I don't know if it's a solution, but if we learn something from Peru, is that we're going to have changes and changes. We're going to have a change in government, and better than waiting for another election for another president, another Congress. We've seen so many changes that it's better to give the voice to the people in Peru than to wait for a crisis to push Boluarte and the Congress to change. And that's why I think that elections are necessary. They're not might not be necessary right now, but it's going to happen next week or very soon. So it's going to happen. It's just only how many votes we're going to need to in Congress to make it come true. And for Jimena and Tania, we're almost out of time, but I understand that you also agree with the elections. But my question for you is, if we do not have an election, as according to the latest news from Eduardo, what is the forecast? What is if they don't call for elections? What can happen? Jimena, can you answer that? And I'll give you the last word. Obviously, what's happened with the Congress, what we're going to be seeing, it's an increase in the crisis. People are not protesting only for the election; they are asking for the uh, resignation of President Boluarte. They don't. That is very serious. So honestly, I am afraid that we're going to be much worse before we can get better. I'm sorry I can be so pessimistic, but we should be looking for an exit to the crisis. But I start with the basis that there is no road to an ideal exit. We are going to have any resolution is going to be unstable, polarized. That's inevitable. I think that the question is if we know that that is going to happen, because it is going to happen, because this is not stable, we don't have a perfect democratic system. We're not going to have basically better. So what can we do to get out of this worst time possible? Is the worst moment is when people's lives are at risk. They are placing their people are placing their lives at risk for claiming their legitimate rights to protest, not only due to police repression because of the actions of the police, uh, arbitrary decisions, the access to the police office. So everything puts people at risk. Even if these manifestations or demonstrations end, because people have to go back to their town, they have to work, and have to eat. Uh, Anything else is going to make them blow up again in a month, 2 weeks, 3 months. And I also think that the problem that we're facing is that those who are accusing the protesters as violent groups, and I hope I am mistaken, but I think they're the sowing the seeds to have the prophecy. So people are going to say, okay, I protest and I protest and I protest, and nothing happens. They continue to vote against me in the Congress. What do I do? And they're not giving people some way to channel their demands. Uh, we are throwing the country to the wolves. Tania, please. Keeping in mind this scenario where the Congress has rejected the current proposal, that the legislative and the executive don't want to leave their positions, they're screwed onto to their positions because we have a high percentage of disapproval, of rejection by the country that is and then there's the question is what are the most interesting interests about, but they're way more than the reality in Peru. Lack of contentment uh, um, and a country that is unstable, and we're not walking to towards to an improvement. This has meant a lot of step backs for many political policies that we have been contributing to. So I think that by not having this scenario where the population was asking for a new election, this increases the protest. So, and I also think that when you ask yourself, what is the time to make the changes? Do we need a new constitution or not? There are two things. The first thing is that I think that what we need right now as citizens to all social sectors in our country is to start a dialogue, an open dialogue, uh, a process that will lead to a joint platform to see what is going to contain that constitution. We have to learn from the lessons from Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, but in the Cuban case, in the Peruvian case, we need that dialogue among the sectors, so we don't get there to propose a very important right for a group, and in fact, whoever was your ally is opposed to that uh, proposition. This means we're not prepared in everything, but the ideal thing is to strengthen our dialogues. But the current Congress, this Congress that is rejected by the population, has been making reforms to the Constitution, and not about 2 or 3 articles, tens of articles. This Parliament intends to modify the Constitution, for example, for the election of the members of the National Elections Board. The National Election Board is the entity that monitors the elections. Mm, That they should, the Congress nominating those members is aberrant. The Congress nominating the general controller for the country, for the republic. This Congress has taken on powers for creating a constitution with reforms that are very dangerous, that are in the sense that there's no balance where you say this Congress is really protecting the common issues of the country. They seem to be creating conditions to take over uh, the the rest of the country, because we know that in our country, like the institutions are broken down, even legality has become illegal. The parliament, you don't respect the laws that are enacted by parliament. So I think that this situation is not healthy for the country. This new topics or the agenda where we don't have a connection to the crisis uh, with this situation with Ms. Baluarte is really harmful for the country. Not only instability, that is going to affect us deeply, not only in our condition as citizens with rights, but also our living conditions, uh, in addition to the process of the pandemic, which uh, have shown such inequalities. The regions in the south of the Andes, of the Amazon regions, which are very from the capital cities, are the worst off. As Jimena says, well, we in a very difficult scenario in Peru, but I think that all these scenarios also to shows the opportunity to start these dialogues with the citizens, start to open a debate with sectors with whom we haven't had any rapprochement. The workers, the unions, the trades associations, uh, indigenous women, the professionals, the academia, those who study these topics, who analyze that. I think it's important for them to know what they hear, what they think about as citizens. So that can, I think that somehow we can have some some way out to create a new and different scenario for our country. Thank you, Tanya. We have 5 more minutes, and I wanted to mention a little comment from Boz, and I think Jimena. It's something about from your specialty. What has the impact been of this current crisis on the economy? And Boz, you work a lot with foreign investors, and you're familiar with those topics. So I'm going to start with you, Boz. What is the impact on the economy, and what could be the impact with a prolonged crisis? Right now, we've seen that. I want to give you the responses of what the government has increased the protests with um, British and Fitch have downgraded Peru, and and uh, and we'll see. I think it's about a growth of 3% this year. It's going to be more like 1%. A lot of the mining is going to close due to everything that's happened with the protest. So a lot of tourism has been cancelled. So a lot of things have happened currently with this with the economy. But more than that is the uncertainty for the coming years. And I think I agree that with some sort of a political reform of the constitution, but the uncertainty that provides in Peru is very bad for investors. They're going to see that Peru, they don't know the rules. Investors can work in a center or right or left government if they know the rules. But when they don't know the rules, and they know that the rules are going to change over the years, one and second again, when they say that the Congress has changed the Constitution a lot during the past year, is very important. And the fact that this is going to affect all investments. They don't want any new projects right now. We're not going to be seeing any major new projects because of the fear to what is happening with the political system. Thank you. Uh, Eduardo, you apparently have the last word about this issue. What do you think? Well, what we're seeing right now is a hit of about between the protests between January, which could be 500 to 650 million dollars at the most. That is the impact. The GIP in the best of the cases, it would be 0%, and if you push me, it could be a negative. The inflation on food and transportation, or by the last double-digit inflation, food and transportation. This is something we've been having with for several years, but has become more solid and harder in January. Let's not speak about mining. The Bahamas, which is 1% of the GDP, are temporarily closed. So we hope that it will be a temporary. But if this is replicated in other mining projects, it could be the final stroke. Um, uh, Tourist-related expenses have gone down 30 or 50%, retail 50% down, up to 60% or 70%. The trade associations are estimating that. So it's an outlook that is not really clear uh, for the investors, for the private activity. And if we add to that the state, the government, they are not taking into consideration any measures to have impact on public expenditure. We don't see a class 1 hospital. We don't have any sanitary infrastructure. We don't see any major impact education institutions. That has a lot of reflection of the private investment. They haven't bet on a state that is not democratic and that won't invest. So the outlook is very austere for 2023, and we hope that this can bounce back before the end of 2023, but we don't think so. Right now, it's uncertain. Thank you, Eduardo. We almost up to the time and second to finish. I don't know whether Jimena or Tania want to add something about it, uh, or can we complete? Can we close? I agree with the specialists who know that, and I think that the figures show the impact of this crisis on investors, on major business, and so on. The solution is in the government's hands, the president and the Congress. It is not in our hands. The community doesn't have the solution, but I think that it has small economies twice or three times as hard because there is not a single economy in our country. There are many economies. In that small economy of small entrepreneurs, merchants, artisans, uh, women, tourists, those tourist guides are the ones that are hit the hardest. They are being unemployed. I think that 70% of the population in our country is of informal economy. So they live day to day. So if they don't work, they don't eat. So I think this would be the reasons to solve the crisis. And I changed it. The question is, you have the solutions in your hands to calm down and put a cold uh, uh, compress on what is going on. And I don't see that. I see that because we have a lot of families in regions where the population live day to day and they live off this small informal economy or the small businesses. And it does affect the major economy, but in our country also gets revenue from other resources that our country carries out. Thank you, Tania. Thank you, everyone. It has been very important 75 minutes. As always, we will continue with our conversations, and we're going to be continue with this major coverage. For those who want to see the video, even with the translation into English. You can find that in our website from tomorrow at ccacanada.com. Thank you everyone for being with us today, especially again uh, thanks to the panel members and our interpreter, Roberto. With that, good evening to everyone. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.